So welcome to another Feature Fridays, and again, I'm honoured to be joined by Jorg. So Jorg, for those who don't know you already, I don't know where they've been, again, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. My name is Jorg. I work as a technical product manager in VMware's Cloud Provider Business Unit.
Thanks, Jorg. And my name, for people who don't know me, is Guy Bartram. I'm Director of Product Marketing in the Cloud Services Business Unit. And today we're going to be talking about a feature that's been around for a little while with Cloud Director. It's a centralized point and management, or otherwise known as CPOM. And CPOM's really, it's been around a little while, and I think it's really as a response to service providers needing to provide better coverage for dedicated private cloud environments to their customers and provide that single pane of glass view. Jorg, what is CPOM kind of in a nutshell then for the people who are watching today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, CPOM technically allows a service provider to offer dedicated vCenter servers to their tenants through the cloud provider tenant portal. So when you have that business model to host dedicated private cloud for your tenants, together with a shared infrastructure that you use in Cloud Director with the organization VDCs, provider VDCs, and so on, and your tenants are used to use the cloud provider portal, you can now even offer these dedicated private clouds and dedicated vCenter access through the Cloud Director portal.
And as I'm just sharing now, this 451 research shows there is obviously VCD today, is very much, has always been, sorry, not just today, but has always been very focused on providing multi-tenanted public cloud. And as you can see here, there's obviously, a huge growth going on in public cloud. Tends to be more thought about, from a hyperscaler perspective, being the provider of public cloud. But obviously for our VCPP partners, public cloud is something you deliver with Cloud Director as well. And what we can equally see here is a growth in not only hosted private cloud, but on-premise private cloud infrastructure as well, quite a significant growth. And this is ongoing, with customers, potentially larger customers or customers who want to have that physically segregated environment for perhaps security reasons or other reasons, and is a growing kind of trend to provide this. And what you just mentioned, makes absolute sense, right? As a service provider, I want to have one control plane for all of my different services, whether they're public cloud or dedicated private cloud, or indeed connecting through to an on-premise private cloud environment, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So central point of management, so CPOM allows you as a service provider to really use the portal from Cloud Director and even the APIs. That's another interesting aspect to manage and give access to these dedicated vCenter servers as well.
Okay, cool. So should we have a quick walk around CPOM setup and how it looks from a tenant and provider UI?
Yeah, so let's start. Let me share my screen here. And let's start with the tenant interface. So I'm connected to my Cloud Director portal as an organization admin. And let's assume the service provider already has, configured. I'm in business with them. I have an organization VDC that you can see here in the main VDC tab. But I also have, I'm a customer of a dedicated private cloud, so I also got my dedicated private vCenter server from my service provider. And the service provider has set up the access for me. We will see later in the provider demo what steps are necessary to do that. But now, as a tenant user or a tenant administrator, I have this additional tab here in my data centers with the dedicated vSphere data centers. And when I open that up, I now see these different tiles for my dedicated private cloud. So each tile represents one vCenter connection and the corresponding clusters that are in there. Typically, these dedicated vCenter servers are, usually it's one cluster with certain resources that I get from my provider. So physical ESX hosts, and then I get more or less full administrative access to this vCenter server. And what CPOM does in VCD, it allows now me as an org administrator or org user to access the vSphere server directly through a proxy. So I don't need any direct net connection to that vCenter server. The connection is really proxied through the Cloud Director portal. To make that happen, you have to configure your browser properly. So that's what's stated here in the help, in the setup help. We also have a browser plugin for Chrome that you can install that does that automatically. But here, just for if you don't have that VCD plugin installed into the browser, you just have one configuration setting manually. Now, once that is done, then you really can open up the vSphere. The connection is through an authenticated proxy, so it can happen, or it should happen, that you have to authenticate the first time to the proxy, and that's with your username and password, or username with the VCD, and then a generically created password that you can copy to the clipboard here or also view. And then when you open up vSphere, you should see it opens up in a new tab. And if you do that the first time, then you would get proxy authentication credentials. So you have to put in that username and that password that you copy to your clipboard from that authenticates the browser against the proxy. And then once that connection is established, then through the proxy, you can access your vSphere server, and then from here, VCD is more or less out of the box. It just establishes the tunnel, and then your browser directly can communicate with the vCenter server, and then you log in with your vCenter credentials. So that authentication is completely then separate from any VCD connection, which gives you all the flexibility as a provider to either keep it completely out of that business and just tell the dedicated customer, well, here's your vCenter server, and go ahead, configure whatever user credentials you want to have, whatever IDM you need for that. Or as a provider, if it's more a managed private cloud offering, you would just give something like a cloud admin user that does not have full administrative access. But that's something that's just vSphere configuration, and VCD is not intercepting any of that.
So I think so am I correct in saying that the service provider in this case, then, because it's a proxied configuration, wouldn't need to have a VPN hardware or combination device next to the vCenter?
Yeah, that's one of the big advantages here, that this connection, even if I'm connected here to all the different domain name resolutions, still should work from the browser, but there is no need for a direct or VPN network connection between the browser and that vCenter server, because that connection happens from the browser through the proxy that runs in the VCD portal, and that connection you already have as soon as the browser can access the tenant portal in VCD.
Right. Okay, cool. And does that support maybe a relevant question, possibly an irrelevant question for me, no surprise there, but would that support reverse proxy situations?
So that is something. The proxy is an authenticated proxy, so the browser has to have access to that public endpoint, public portal of VCD, and whatever you have as a provider in front of that VCD has to pass through these authenticated proxy requests to the VCD server itself. So typically it works perfectly fine with load balancers or web application firewalls or whatever firewall that you have in front of that. If you have another reverse proxy as a provider in front of that, you have to configure it so that it passes through the authentication, the proxy authentication, to the VCD portal rather than trying to do some authentication for its own.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah, once I'm connected to vSphere, well, that's my regular dedicated vCenter, my 3 ESX hosts, the physical ESX hosts that I get from my provider here. And then I have, the full access, so I can deploy new virtual machines. I can access the virtual machines themselves, and of course also have access to the console of the virtual machine. So that works in the same way as your regular on-prem vCenter server access would work.
So that's brilliant. So, if providers are looking to offer dedicated private clouds, then this is really the way to do it. Is there any limitations that providers need to be cognizant of?
The limitations that we currently have is, well, for the console access, the remote console. So VMware Remote Console does not support connecting to vCenter through an authenticated proxy. So you just can, as a user, just can use the web console for that. And for any other API clients or automation clients that you would use to connect to that vCenter server through the proxy, again, they have to support authenticated proxy connection, which, for example, works fine for Power CLI, but does not work if you have an orchestrator server, vRealize orchestrator server on-prem, and then connect that with the vCenter plugin there to this vCenter server. But these are typically some corner cases, because in a lot of cases, the automation that you would do, or any work you would do, the components for the automation also runs in that vCenter server.
Yeah,
which is then a local connection.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, then let's switch over to the provider side to see how to set up the environment that it works properly. I'm going to stop sharing here and going to share my other browser window. Okay, so here I'm connected to the provider portal of Cloud Director as a provider administrator. And we have in the resources tab here these infrastructure resources. And that's the section where you register vCenter server in VCD, no matter if you are going to use them as dedicated private cloud dedicated SDDCs for your tenants, or as part of your shared infrastructure, so as backend resource providers for your provider VDCs.
Yeah,
it's all the same way. If you would add your vCenter server here, go through that wizard, and then in this third step with the access configuration, that's where it asks you if this vCenter server is going to be used as an SDDC for tenant access or not. And depending on what you type in here, you get this different usage options here, either for infrastructure as a service, that is the these two with the -15 and -50. These two vCenter servers are vCenter servers that are backing my provider VDCs, and the other one, that -10 here, is one dedicated SDDC, dedicated vCenter server that as a provider I plan to offer to one of my tenants.
And is there a 6.7 I see as the version there? Is there any limitation on the vCenter or vSphere version that you're using?
I don't think so, since the connection, well, VCD does not really care about a lot of details for these SDDC connections. So it has, I guess, to be a supported vCenter version, old unsupported version, but I think it should work from 6.5 or newer.
And what's the cluster health indicator?
Yeah, so that is something in this list. You can see that the VCD also connects some basic information from these different vCenter servers, like just the number of clusters, the number of VMs that are running in there, and all the connection or the utilization here, and just the overall cluster health that's reported by vCenter server. And that you can see in the details here. I mean, that's something which is really just the overall cluster health. So if it's green, it's fine. If it's not green, then you have to go into vCenter to figure out what's the issue here. One interesting aspect, so once you connected VCD and selected that you want to offer vCenter server to a tenant, then in the details of this vCenter server, you have this manage tenant access. That's where you select which tenants should have access to this vCenter server. Again, that configures the tile that we have seen before in the tenant portal for that vCenter server. It does not do at all any user authentication configuration or IDM relations between VCD and this vCenter server.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Now, you can see the current configuration in the tenant. So you can see here that my CC02 tenant, which we connected before, has access to the vCenter server. You can disable tenant access and just reconnect VCD to the vCenter server. Now, one important thing to understand, to make that happen, VCD automatically generates some proxy endpoints, which are services that run within the VCD cell that acts as these proxy towards the vCenter server. And per default, one proxy is created. Well, you can select that when you connect to a vCenter if the proxy should be created, but the default connection that happens is just to the vCenter server itself, but you can add additional proxies so that through the same, to the same connection of the VCD endpoint and the VCD portal, the browser of the tenant user can connect to different other endpoints as well. And that is something useful, for example, if you have, for older vCenter versions, a dedicated external single sign-on system, like an external PSC, platform service controller, in older architectures of vCenter that was recommended. Then you would create here some external proxy for the SSO. If you offer NSX with the vCenter server, then you would create a different proxy, for example, for the NSX endpoint, so that the tenant user can also access their NSX manager through a proxy. And in some cases, well, if the tenant users should have access directly to the ESXi host and their sort of front end or UI, basic web-based UI that an ESX server hosts out of the box, you can create some proxies for that as well as some generic proxies if you might have some, I don't know, third-party solutions that you also want to offer through this proxy connection.
And what's what's a parent proxy?
This parent proxy just defines if it should be sort of, if it organizationally belongs to the vCenter proxy, and if they should be started and restarted and accessed in the same way.
Okay.
Yeah, one new functionality that we added in VCD 10.2 is for the endpoints, where you can just add an additional endpoint that does not necessarily have a proxy. So that would be, it just expands the possible network architecture. So if you do have an environment where you want to offer dedicated private clouds, dedicated vCenters to your tenants, but it is ensured that the tenant users have already network access to the vCenter server, and they do not want to use the proxy, or they do not need this proxy functionality, then you would just create these generic endpoints without a proxy configuration.
And in that case, the tenant would still be accessing the vCenter through through the VCD UI.
Yeah, so they see the vCenter server as that tile in the VCD tenant portal, but when they click to open vSphere, then it directly it redirects them directly to the vCenter server without the browser connecting through a proxy through that vCenter server.
Got it.
So that sort of gives you a more flexibility for a network structure where your tenants are already have some existing network access to the network where vCenter server is located.
And I can see we're getting some sort of status information here and cluster health and things like that. From a point of centralized point of management and centralized point of monitoring, are you able to see events from these separate dedicated private vCenters?
You don't see events, so it's really a very, very basic information gathering that's mainly because of scale, and we don't want to replicate functionality that's another part of solutions like vRealize operations in VCD as well. However, it is still useful because you get some overview again about the cluster health and, let's say, the just the size and the scaling of these dedicated servers, so you know more or less how many VMs a tenant is running and what sort of percentage of CPU, memory, and storage they are using.
Got it. Okay.
And you get that. Imagine as a service provider, hopefully, if you have a successful dedicated private cloud business with a lot of different tenants, you have a lot of different vCenter servers, each one for each tenant, and you can use this as a pretty nice overview to see, to get an inventory of all these different dedicated vCenter servers.
Yeah, sure. But from a management perspective, then you'd still use your vRealize operations, remote collectors, or whatever it is you're using in that environment to Yeah, okay. So
Yeah, so VCD does not do any kind of lifecycle management or deployment or bring up service for these dedicated vCenter servers. That's something that you as a provider either already have a solution or would rather look into things like VCF and the SDDC manager that allows you to automate the bring up of these vCenter servers. So the central point of management in VCD is really complementary to the other vCenter lifecycle management solutions that we have in the portfolio.
Yeah, that's cool. It's really centralized point of access, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there are two more things that I want to mention if you want to try that out. Well, the functionality is included in VCD, so you don't have to install anything special, any additional extension component or so. It's really all comes out of the box with Cloud Director. Two things that are necessary for tenants to get access to these vCenter servers and that you as a provider have to set up, which technically is not really related to CPOM. That's just the way how VCD works. So first of all, that additional dedicated vSphere resources tab that we've seen in the tenant portal and this tile that you see in this overview is provided by a UI plugin into the tenant portal. So as a service provider, when you go to your portal configuration with the customized portal, you can see that there is a CPOM extension as a UI plugin configured. And that is something you as a provider have to intentionally publish for all the tenants that you want to offer these dedicated private cloud. If you don't do that, then you still can create the VCD, the vCenter connections for your own inventory, and you even can create the proxies, but the tenant portal will just not show this dedicated private cloud tab. So that's one thing where, which is pretty much the same for all the other extensions like object storage extensions, app launchpad, container services, and so on, where we allow you as a provider to really do that on a per tenant base to give you the ability to really monetize these additional services.
What's this scope to service providers there? Isn't that by default what you'll have?
Yeah, that is something, depends on the UI plugin. This is this form to configure it is generic. The CPOM extension is really just in the tenant portal, so it doesn't really matter if you activate or deactivate that here.
Sure.
Other UI plugins like App Launchpad have a component that really have some aspect in the provider portal and then a different views in the tenant portal.
Got it. Got it.
Yeah, so that's one thing that you always have to configure for these extensions is the plugins so that the tenant really have this component and the different UI, the objects, the buttons in the tenant portal. And the other thing is that, we have our role-based access control. So every extension and pretty much every functionality in VCD is typically comes with different permissions. And these permissions, you as a service provider bundle, you can bundle into rights bundles and then publish these right bundles or assign them to user roles or publish them to tenants to let the tenants even create their own user roles within the framework that they that you give for them. Excuse me. Yeah, and that is something. These rights bundles you have to configure for the different extensions that you have. So for CPOM, it's the in the infrastructure, the SDDC and vCenter permissions here that are relevant for to allow the user which has assigned these rights to open the vCenter server in vSphere and to view the SDDCs and manage its own access token. So that's something you also have to configure as a service provider, and then you either publish the rights bundle to the tenant that you want to give access and let the tenant decide, to create new users that have these roles. Might be different from the from an org admin user, or you can just add these permissions to the default org administrator roles that come out of the box, and then have the it's in the global rules here, have the automatically the org admin access to the dedicated vCenter servers as well.
So in terms of like a managed service offering, then you're probably going to be looking to, manage things like the certificates and stuff like that on behalf of the customer. You make sure that, yeah, okay. So they
Yeah.
would, yeah.
Yeah, so that is something we didn't discuss yet. Of course, the connection to the proxy and the vCenter server is encrypted via HTTPS. So when you do configure the proxies here, in the proxy configuration, you can manage the certificates and create or add your own certificates, valid certificates that are being used for the connection between the browser then and sort of the the proxy endpoint.
Okay. And you'd get that from, sorry, you'd get that from the proxy itself providing those, or?
Yeah, so by default, the proxy, I think, gets them from the vCenter server. So it's the same certificate that you use for the vCenter server as well, but you can change them if you want to.
Okay, okay.
Either if they expire or you afterwards use some different certificates for the vCenter server itself and then update them in here as well.
So it's pretty flexible, really, for a managed service, but also for a standalone service. It looks like you've got enough rights there to be able to give a tenant administrator quite a lot of control, and especially to the underlying ESXi capabilities as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is something. If you create these proxies for the individual ESXi host as well, then as a tenant user, you can connect through the proxy for direct ESXi access if you want to do that.
Yeah, yeah, that's brilliant. And is there any latency requirement or any connectivity requirements for accessing this if it was a tenant's owned on tenant premise private cloud?
Well, for that we don't have really, I think, any maximum latency requirements, because again, you just have to be aware that the network connection, when a user accesses this dedicated private vCenter through the proxy, it goes from the browser to the proxy and then back to the vCenter server. So if you have the vCenter on-prem, Cloud Director in the service provider data center, and then the browser again sitting somewhere else, the network connections might be pretty long and you get a bad user experience. But yeah, VCD itself does not do a lot of additional stuff beyond that, sort of very spare resource grabbing or grabbing of the status information here. So it does not have necessarily the same, let's say, pretty heavy communication with that vCenter compared to the infrastructure vCenter servers. Here we really have, I think, in the documentation, the requirements for latency and bandwidth, because that's, well, VCD doing a lot of calls to the vCenter servers for the provider VDCs. But for these, it's really just proxying through and getting them into the inventory to be aware, but there's no real ongoing calls being made from VCD to these vCenter servers.
Okay, that's great. Well, is there anything else to see here, Jörg?
One more thing that I want to mention, just for the matter of completeness, as usual in VCD, whatever you see here in the UI is also available through the API. So if we open up the API Explorer from VCD with the new Cloud API endpoint, if it opens up.
And what version was the Cloud API endpoint brought in?
That's a good question. I think in 33.
Okay.
32. So whenever we introduced TPOM, that was available through APIs from the beginning as well.
Right.
So in this, there is an endpoint for SDDCs, and let's see if I can find them. There we go. So there's the endpoint for the proxies, so that you can create and manage the proxies. And there's the endpoint for the SDDCs. So if you use your own API client or Postman, or want to do your own automation around that, you can use this get and then SDDCs to really get a list of all the registered vCenter servers that are have that flag that they are part of the the dedicated private cloud offering. So this SDDC flag.
Yeah.
And you can use this to really get for something like inventory management. So you get a list of all the different SDDCs. You can see that it also returns this resource consumption overview with the number of virtual machines, number of running virtual machines, the overall status you got back with this status flag, the version of the vCenter server, which might be interesting for some kind of fleet management if you have dozens of these vCenter servers. And you get the details of the underlying configured proxies and so on. Yeah. And for these calls, they also allow some filtering, so you can do some pagination and filtering based on name or other different attributes here, so that you, through the APIs, really can use this as central point of management. So you have a centralized API, even if you have dozens or hundreds of vCenter servers that you offer to your different tenants.
Yeah, that's great. And you can obviously use this for getting information around billing as well, right? And pulling information back around, there you go, the tenants.
Yeah, so that helps as well. I mean, usually when you do these dedicated private cloud offerings, the business model is rather based on the physical resources that you provide to them. Then it's rather the size of the cluster that matters here. But at least for some basic inventory, of course, you can use these APIs to really get them from a central point.
That's awesome. And where's the, sorry, one last question. Where's the CPOM plugin available from? Is it the standard?
That comes out of the box with VCD. So whenever you install VCD, your first VCD cell, then the CPOM extension already is there because it's part of the core VCD functionality.
Okay, brilliant, brilliant. Oh, that's fantastic, Jörg. I think this is a really cool utility, and like I say, it's been around for a little while. It's nice to kind of see it in action and go over its capabilities, especially with, you know, I think the growth in hosted private cloud, and certainly what we're seeing with the, you know, growth in hyper-converged infrastructures as well, with VMware Cloud Foundation and Lifecycle Manager being kind of built in now. It's going to become I think, a valuable offering for our service provider partners.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that we didn't see in my demo is, if you remember the other feature Fridays when we talked about customization of the provider portal, or the tenant portal, you can add your branding and your logo to the Cloud Director tenant portal as well. And then if you have your tenants connecting through that, it just gives some more sort of stickiness of your provider name and brand to the tenant. And since again, the cloud provider CPOM functionality offers this proxy connection, it does not require you to have some additional VPN capabilities. You can do that if that's part of the overall service offering. You can use these generic endpoints without the proxies. But if you just have, or if you have a new offering or a very sort of simple architecture, then CPOM allows you as a very thin layer in between to offer a much more converged sort of user experience, because your tenant users can access their VMs that run in the shared org VDC that you offer as a provider, as well as perhaps some additional dedicated clusters that they get, or dedicated vCenter servers that they have.
Yeah, that's really nice. And when you're looking at the kind of the desire for customers to be able to access everything from one portal, public cloud, private cloud, hosted private clouds, you know, it's all there, and all the applications with it as well. Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you very much again, Jörg. Thank you for configuring the setup and showing us through the CPOM functionality. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.